She said that every single day she takes a little bit of time in the car in the morning, before the day begins, before the chaos creeps in, before she gets hijacked for Jesus. And she takes a moment to herself and she sits in silence. And she said, that silence in the midst of all of the chaos that's happening in the world, of all of the need of a congregation, of all of the need of my family, allows me space to breathe. And in that space, she said, the silence allows space. Space that my brain might fall into my heart. And that's what we want when we come into this place. That we can put aside this thinking brain that we have that's worried about what groceries do I need? What am I going to prepare for Monday to bring to the Legion Hall? I need to make this card. I need to do laundry. I need to prepare myself for next week. I need to make this visit next week or this visit next week. I need to do my taxes. All of these things that are on your brain, right? When you walk through those doors, we have to grant ourselves space so that that overactive brain might fall into our hearts and we might truly encounter the Spirit of God that flows in this place, that flows in each and every one of you. So I invite you to take a minute. Close your eyes, open yourself up. Take a deep breath in and let that breath out slowly. Take another deep breath in and let it out slowly. And continue to breathe slowly and with intention. And every time you inhale the breath of God, the Spirit of God that dwells within you. And every time you exhale, you grant yourself space away from the movement and the chaos of the world. Inhale and exhale. Creator God, we invite you into this space. The living God, the living breath of life, that we might be filled and encouraged, that our brains might fall into our hearts and we might encounter the real you, the God that walks beside us in the valley, the God that grants us peace in times of trouble. God, may you challenge us and force us to grow and to evolve, to pivot and to form into the beings that you created us to be. Cloaked in compassion and mercy and filled and sent with grace. May you be in the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart, that we might be your hope in the world. And all of the children of God proclaim together. Amen. Friends, if we're honest, if we're truly honest with one another, there's a piece of us, however small it might be, that doesn't really believe. That doesn't. If we're honest, there's a piece that still has a lingering doubt about the presence of God in our lives, about the power of the Spirit and how much power it truly carries in the world. There's doubt. And our doubt, it creeps into our walk of faith in ways that frankly we don't even begin to comprehend. It affects the way that we worship in this space. It affects the way that we serve. It affects the way that we give with our time and our gifts and our money. It also affects the way that we treat one another. The way that we treat ourselves. It affects our perspective of the larger world. And it affects our ability to surrender. But doubt, like anything, it comes and it goes, right? We can all acknowledge that in our lives, that we've had seasons and moments of great doubt. But we've also had seasons and moments of great faith, right? When those moments happen, those moments of exuberant faith happen. We feel alive when it kicks in. And doubt seems to no longer be present, right? We forget all about the doubts that we had in the moment previous, because right now I am filled and sent with faith, right? What doubt? What doubt? It's as though it never existed at all. And in those moments where we're filled with faith, we feel kind of transformed, right? You can acknowledge, raise your hand if you ever felt transformed a little bit by your faith that's working inside. Don't be ashamed, it's okay. I felt those moments of transformative faith, right? But oftentimes those moments are immediately preceded by huge periods of doubt, where we doubted everything. But when we're in a season of faith, it's almost as though we can truly appreciate the glory of God, right? But when doubt is wholly present in our lives, it's overwhelming. If you've ever been in that season, you know how overwhelming it can be. Instead of seeing love around every single corner, all we see is the way that God appears to have failed us. All we see is the way that God abandoned us. And those instances can feel so abundant. Like everywhere we look is another place where God failed. How can God be real and truly divine and allow me to lose my loved one, the person that I cared so much for, my partner, my child, my friend, my aunt, my uncle? How could God be divine and allow that to happen? How can God be all-knowing and just allow my heart to be broken by a spouse that cheated or left me? How? And how can God be the Savior and the light of the world and allow me to be abused physically or sexually? How? How can those two things exist at the same time? How can these things be true? And when doubt is the thing that leads our conscious thought, it's hard to see the goodness of God. Everywhere we look, we see the ways that God has failed us. It's hard to see the compassion and grace that walks along and shepherds us through this journey. And when our vision is clouded, when our eyes are jaded, we think that we compare the grace that we've received to the pain that we've endured. But that's not what's happening. We think that we compare those things, and then somehow we weigh out on our own scales of justice every struggle that we've encountered with every time we've encountered the grace of God. And when we're in a season of doubt, the scale does not balance. It leans overwhelmingly to all of the ways that God has failed us, all of the struggles that we've encountered in this life. We can't comprehend the goodness of God in that space. Well, if God died for my sins, that goes over here. But what about all of the ways that I've struggled? What about all of these past 5 years that I've encountered this toxic relationship where I've been beaten down emotionally day after day and I've lost my sense of self-worth? What about that? Well, that certainly weighs much heavier than God dying for my sins. When we're led by doubt, nothing ever seems to balance. All we can see is the way that God fails us. But when we balance the scales, we only account for the grace that we choose to see. For the pain that we have in our lives, not the plan that God has ordained to be so. And when we let this doubt guide us, we begin to diminish the way that God works in the world. Because you and I have this narrow perspective. Everything that happens is immediately right in front of our faces. We have no perspective on anything. Everything that we encounter is the worst thing that has ever happened. Because we are led by immediacy. The way that God moves in the world is so much greater than you or I. And in this place of doubt, we begin to rationalize the thought that maybe, just maybe, God isn't really God after all. And maybe, just maybe, Jesus isn't really the one that that spun the world on its head and transformed each and every one of us. Maybe. Just maybe. And my friends, we aren't the only ones in this struggle. You aren't the only one that carries that doubt. The disciples encountered it themselves. Much in the same way that you did, the doubt of not being quite sure. Not being quite sure that Jesus was the one. Despite the miracles, despite the lessons, despite the divine touch of goodness and godliness in his life, they weren't sure. I don't know, I'm not really impressed. In the scripture that we read today from Matthew about the transfiguration, well, the title of this passage is Sunlight Poured from His Face. And it goes a little something like this. 6 days later, 3 of them saw that glory. Jesus took Peter and the brothers James and John and led them up a high mountain. His appearance changed from the inside out, right before their eyes. And sunlight poured from his face. His clothes were filled with light. Then they realized that Moses and Elijah were also there in deep conversation with him. And Peter broke in, Master, this is a great moment. You should take a picture. What would one think if I built 3 memorials here on the mountain, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah? While he was going on like this babbling, a light, radiant cloud enveloped him. Sounding from deep in the cloud a voice, this is my son, marked by my love, focus of my delight. Listen to him. And when the disciples heard it, they fell flat on their faces, scared to death. But Jesus came over and touched them. Don't be afraid. And when they opened their eyes and looked around, all they saw was Jesus. Only Jesus. Coming down the mountain, Jesus swore them to secrecy. Don't breathe a word of what you've seen. After the Son of Man is raised from the dead, you're free to talk. You see, up to this point on the mountain, Jesus had been doing his work. He'd been praying and healing. He'd been teaching and flipping tables and guiding. He'd been transforming lives. But even Peter wasn't convinced. Is this truly the Son of Man? I haven't seen anything impressive yet. Is this all we're going to get? Is this really the person that the prophets spoke of? Or is he just a guy doing crazy things? Think about that for a moment. Truly think about that idea. After getting to this opportunity to walk side by side with Jesus over all of this time, over this ministry period where Jesus is doing all of the hard work, where Jesus is actively involved in ministry, walking down roads and healing people, they still weren't convinced. And if we're honest, if we're really honest, I want you to get real with me for a minute. There's moments that you aren't convinced either. There's moments when you haven't been overwhelmed by the way that God has moved in your life, and you say, is this all I'm going to get? Is this it? And that speaks to some of the worst pieces of our character. It really does. Our quick ability to doubt. This idea of, what have you done for me lately? Imagine watching Jesus right in front of you heal the blind. Watching him raise someone from the dead and walk on water and still being like, is that all? I'm not sold. The used car salesman would hate you, right? Have you not seen enough? And when we say say it out loud when we talk about it. It's funny, but it's ludicrous, right? But in that moment, in that instance, for the disciples, the doubt was so present. And in a second, a split second, all doubt was erased. 6 days later, 3 of them saw that glory. Jesus took Peter and the brothers James and John and led them up a high mountain. And his appearance changed from the inside out, right before their eyes. Sunlight poured from his face. His clothes were filled with light. And then they realized that Moses and Elijah were also there in deep conversation with him. From the very beginning of this passage, 6 days later, 3 of them saw that glory. They saw it with their own eyes. How powerful. That's this space that our hearts get to encounter God is through glory by witnessing and ultimately surrendering to the glory of God that moves all around each and every one of us. But there's surrender in that. And these 3 disciples, they got to witness this moment of transformation and transfiguration that Jesus had. And in a millisecond, all of that doubt that they had that swelled from their pores, well, it instantly turned into awe and faith. And they recognized that Jesus was having a moment just like Moses did before him. We read that passage. And just like Elijah did before him. And they realized that the doubts that they had, the doubts that were guiding them, were standing directly in the way of them encountering God, completely blocking them from receiving the grace that Jesus was trying to hand them. They had their blinders up, being led by the doubt and fear that they carried. And in that moment, the transformation wasn't just for Jesus. It was also for the disciples. God reaches down into the world and he offers a word. This is my son, marked by my love, focus of my delight. Listen to him. And when the disciples heard it, they fell flat on their faces, scared to death. But Jesus came over and touched them and he said, don't be afraid. And when they opened their eyes and looked around, here's the kicker. When they opened their eyes and looked around, all they saw was Jesus, only Jesus. And here comes a voice of confirmation. Confirmation that speaks directly to the heart of the disciples, and it brings with it an assurance that Jesus is the one that they had hoped for, the one that they had wished for. He was everything that they hoped that he was. And in that moment, for the very first time, those 3 disciples were able to see him, to truly see Jesus. And that's the reality of our experience, my friends. The truth is, our doubt isn't really doubt. It's fear. Crippling and overwhelming fear that all of the things that we hope and dream are real, well, they aren't really at all. Our greatest fear, that all of the hope and love and investment that we poured into this thing isn't really real. That the grace and love that we hope to encounter in our weakest moments, that it won't be there when we need it. That the God that we reach for in the lowest and darkest moments of our lives won't reach back out to us. So as human beings, we recoil and we retreat back to our warm and comfortable doubts. Back to a world where we say, what have you done for me lately? I'm not going to invest in that. I remember this bad interaction I had at church, so I'm not going to go to church anymore. I remember you didn't bring me back that pan that I lent you. I'm not going to lend you anything again. I remember last time we talked, we had an argument, so I'm not going to talk to you anymore. What have you done for me lately? Back to, is that all? Is that all I'm going to get? I'm not impressed. But while we're in this world of doubt, in this world of calculating the scales of justice in our own favor, the work of God is still happening. It's happening with or without us. God is making a way in the world and distributing peace and grace without fail. And my friends, God still needs you. Desperately so. Needs you to show up, needs you to receive your blessings, and needs you to walk in a humble faith. But the choice is yours. In this moment and all the moments to come, just as it was in the previous moment and all the moments that came before, the choice is yours. You can continue to be led by doubt. You can continue to incorrectly calculate and compare the grace that you've received to the pain that you've endured. Or you can be transformed. You can be ignited and renewed, restored, and reconciled with God. You can be covered and called, because on the other side of fear is love. And in love, there is always God. Now, the Lord is the Spirit, and where the Spirit of the Lord is, there's freedom. And we all, with unveiled faces, beholding the glory of the Lord, are being transformed into the same image from one degree of glory to another. For this comes from the Lord, who is the Spirit. Thanks be to God.